Yeah, I'm noticing. I notice a certain frequency of nervousness that doesn't happen usually, but it did happen now. So I'm wondering what that's about. Um, I'm also noticing in terms of what we just heard from Cheryl and Tara. There's a lot of recognition in, I think, the methodology. I think we might work slightly less structured. I think we might work from a different soil or from a different starting point. But there's a lot of recognition, and so I'm very curious to kind of dive into this and in this context present the this idea of the RCO and this work that's unfolding with the RCO. And so just to provide like a light frame for where we're headed before I'm going to ask you something, Nils, is one of the things that we discovered is that how we incorporate actually has a lot to do with how we are able to talk to one another. And so, as we started collaborating some 5 years ago, maybe, or a little bit more, maybe even, um, we started really looking at incorporation and looking at what if, and how can we find alignment between this legal structure as well as with what we're trying to do, as well as with how we're trying to do. So that's kind of the very, very high level frame. And we'll be talking about some technical stuff, and we'll be talking about some not so technical stuff, and we'll be giving some examples. And then we'll ask some questions. I think that's the overarching arc of what we're doing. And what I wanted to ask you, Nils, is some sort of intro is like, why in the world did we start asking these questions about how we incorporate? And what have you, when you look at it now, this work that we've been doing over 5 years in terms of legal structures, legal organizational structures, what is it about?
Mm, thank you. Uh, it's always interesting to interact with you on kind of a stage for once, because we do this all the time, more or less every day. And I think that's a pattern that we can see in uh, Cheryl and Tara as well. Well, we didn't start out thinking about legal structures or how to incorporate it at all. We started out talking and sensing that we wanted to do something together. It actually came as a question from Amit way earlier, like a couple of years earlier, even that, hey, why don't we do something together? Um, and then it took a couple of years, and then suddenly we found something to start exploring. And I think the I think looking back, what had shifted in both of us was kind of the horizon we were looking towards. I had been looking towards horizons of mostly creative entrepreneurship, mostly for myself, mostly wanted to just create cool stuff and put it into the world. And if I could make money and find success in it, fantastic. But my vision started shifting a little bit, and I think that's somehow where we met. Like, we didn't say it like that, but I think between the lines, we were kind of asking each other, like, are we looking at the same horizon? Like, we want to go somewhere differently with our entrepreneurship because we both have a deep background in business and entrepreneurship. And then we tried to figure out what we wanted to do. And we both had the habit of creating companies. So it quite quickly centered around we should probably create a company because we had done it so many times, a habitual pattern in both of us, because that's how we have learned to do things in the world. And then in that process of both finding out what we wanted to do, uh, the question appeared kind of as a side note initially, that it just didn't feel as if what we were trying to do fit in any of the legal organizational structures or designs that we were familiar with. And I had the personal experience of having co-founded or co-started about 20 companies and had seen firsthand that my passion or drive or purpose always got lost along the way somehow. And I didn't really, it took me a while to understand why that was. And one of the, it's not the only thing, but one of the sense making insights for me was that, well, it gets eaten by the system somehow down the line. And I didn't want that to happen with what we wanted to create. So I think for me, it was, I really want to nurture and protect what we wish to put into the world. And it seems that needs some kind of scaffolding. There's, we need to work not only with what's in us and between us, but we also need to put it in some kind of context and container. So as it potentially grows or starts interacting with other people and other parts of society, it doesn't get, it doesn't lose its sense of self. It doesn't lose why it even started. I think that's how, looking back, I can see that it began. But it's also interesting that, like, two patterns is that we haven't known what we've been doing for quite some time. We've just felt that this is important. We were meant to create a company. It took us 4 years to create the company because we had to figure out a legal structure all of a sudden. Um, I think that's one pattern. And the other is that it it's this experience of something that's emerging through relationship, through us not talking about legal structures all the time, but talking about our kids and what's going on inside us and what I just saw in the news or something else. And then magically, synchronistically, it, a pattern somehow appears through that sharing and that mutual interaction. And then suddenly, 3 months into that exploration, we saw something. It was very non-linear and no one could plan for it or see it. And we thought we were starting a company, and then we instead created a new organizational form. If I kind of turn the mirror to you, perhaps not even with the same question, just turning the mirror to you, what wants to be said through you on it, connected to that in this moment?
Mm, I think that's a perfect starting point for showing a few slides and talking a little bit about it. And I might connect to what you're saying through that, just to these visual material. I think one of the feelings that we had, and one of the things that we've been employing is this idea of um, repurposing infrastructure, repurposing existing things. So working with what is, and that's why I think Carol's in the breakout room there when she's talking about the present is so beautiful. Like on one end, the horizon, that future, that thing that is all the way over there that we're never going to attain, and then on the other hand, the present. Um, those are relevant frames. I'm going to share some slides and just to kind of give those that need like pictures also give them something. But this is the RCO, and let's see if I can. Yeah, here was our starting point. It was very much what Nils was referring to. I think that both of us were awakening to the fact that the world is not in a little bit of trouble, but it's like there's a lot going on, and we want us wanting to become more and more instrumental in there. Initially, perhaps in some sort of heroic way, but increasingly so, I would say, in more of a way of serving or doing what's ours to do. But also this idea that business is it's an incredibly powerful technology. It's like the institutional power of business is extraordinary. I mean, for better and for worse. Look at all of the things that we have created and done, all of the violence and all of the creation that's happened as a result of business. And fundamentally, I think both of us believe in business. It's an extraordinary and truly awesome technology. And so this was kind of the question that we were living with, or living into, or still living into. What if business came back into relationship with the world? What if we could not do it as a separate thing over there? What if we could not do business as something that's like an externality generator, but rather something that had to do with the world? And I'm not going to go. Usually, we would go into this a lot, but I'm kind of assuming that this is something that people are familiar with. we are we perceive ourselves to be at least in the complex quadrant here and moving towards the chaotic. So there's also something in us where we are really trying to get a structure in place that allows us to really experiment and then sense and then respond. So we want to move out of this idea that we can plan and know our way out of where we are at the moment, and like move into this sort of complexly informed structure. And we could talk more about this if this was a bad skip through it, then so be it, and we'll explain more of it on questions. But I think we're really trying to foster this possibility for inquiry, and foster this possibility for not knowing as a core principle of how we build our businesses. So scaffold what needs to be scaffolded, what needs to be nurtured and protected, as you said, Nils, but not more than that. So I guess sufficiency, you could also say, like sufficiently scaffolded, but not completely safe or controlled.
Yeah, there's a slight addition, like the right-hand side can be looked at as kind of a mechanistic worldview, and the left-hand side can be looked at more of a living systems kind of worldview. So, in a mechanistic world, we can control things and understand things and figure things out. While in a living system, emergent worldview, we cannot. And our core belief is that we're in a living system. That's kind of where we're operating from at the moment, and have been for quite some time.
Yeah, yeah. And I think not as if, but actually that's the case. So yeah, there it is. Like, what if companies are actually living systems? What if all of the most important parts of the companies are alive, and therefore the company is a more generative way to relate to the company as a living thing? And that brings us to the RCO and this stupid acronym. It's a good acronym, but the regenerative community organism was just something that we blurted out at some point, and then it stuck, and now we're stuck with it for better and for worse, I think. It does consist of 3 pillars, and I'm going to kind of hop, skip, and jump through this. So it's going to be a little bit fast, but then we'll do 2 examples of what it looks like in the world. And then we'll open for questions. But the important parts here is that we are a for-purpose type entity. That's what we're orienting towards. We want to align, as I mentioned very briefly in the start, all of the parts towards this purpose. Money becomes a means. We become means. All of that is towards this purpose that this entity is living into. And something that we found quite recently, but it has had an incredible amount of power, is to formulate that purpose as a question. So it's not a purpose statement, it's a purpose question. And something really happens in terms of attractive power when we formulate something as a question. There's a space left that can pull people in, that people can fall into, and start discovering and participating in a different way than you can with a statement. The source code is a text document. It's basically outlining the question, statements that need to be in terms of what we're supposed to do, principles, and maybe a few key processes that we need. Very, very brief, intended to be used. The second part, and here, like, if you see the purpose as sort of the North Star or whatever, and then you have two parts underneath that, which is again pulled from that living systems. You could tell this story in terms of the right brain or the left brain. You could tell the story in terms of the masculine or the feminine principle. You could tell the story in a lot of different ways. But the shape that we are proposing is that one part here is a non-profit association. A non-profit association becomes the steward of purpose. And then there's a limited company, and the limited company is sort of directed part, the go-getting, the hunter, if you will. So a focused, a slightly more certain part that relates to and defers some of its power to the non-profit association. another way to say it, that the limited company hires the non-profit association to keep it on track. So there's a shareholding that happens in the non-profit association, and there's an invitation for the community to join the non-profit association. And the non-profit association kind of holds some stopping power. It says it has a veto over change of purpose. It has a veto over investors that come in. But otherwise, it can't really tell the limited company what to do. That is something that the limited company needs to figure out on its own. But it has assistance. The non-profit association does one more service, and that is to appoint half of the board of the limited company. So indirectly, you have an idea of the governance in the limited company, but not directly in the operations, but indirectly. So this sort of self-balancing, autopoietic or opponent processing entity is what we're hoping generates a better outcome for whatever we're trying to do in this entity. And then finally, we're proposing, since we're talking about living systems, we're proposing a life cycle. So we're saying that this thing lives. So initially, it's probably good that it grows for a while. And then it's probably good that it matures for a while. It focuses on its efficiency. It increases its bottom line or whatever it might be about for a while. And then it might need to live in a bigger entity or a bigger family or another unit. And so it might need to be sold or be reincorporated somewhere else for a while. And in the end, if it's not to be sold or if it's not to live somewhere else, then perhaps it just needs to die. Perhaps it's done its job. So just to introduce those parts, and Nils, I'm going to hand over to you and click over to our cases just to let you take us through them. And any other comments you want to make on this?
I can make a comment before we go. That fourth part, when a company or this structure dies, is basically intended to regenerate. It doesn't end. So whatever energy is left in the system, as in resources, money, IPs, whatever it might be, gets put into the soil again. And we're consciously not going through details here. There are tons of details, legal details that we're skipping, but there are some simple ways to actually allow for that to happen. So the energy in the system can regenerate itself at a point in the future in a new way that's relevant at that point in time. All right, let's move forward. So this took us a couple of years to find, in using a lot of different practices and mostly our relationship. And now it does exist in this dimension, not just in other dimensions. And it's alive in Swedish jurisdiction, and there is an RCO which we're running, which we're going to mention here a bit. It looks as if it's viable in most legal jurisdictions around the world. And the example we have here is that we're running a company called InnoWorks that we describe as a transformation lab and studio for regenerative business. It's through InnoWorks that RCO kind of was invented or emerged or was born, however you want to describe it. And in the InnoWorks example, our purpose question is, how can we transform business to create the world we want our kids to live in, or we want for our kids? The two connected entities in this example in Sweden is a nonprofit association called Awareness Association, and then the limited private company called InnoWorks AB. AB is limited in Sweden. And then the life cycle, obviously that plays out over time. But we have decided to put a signal that we're moving from a sprouting phase to a maturing phase financially when there's a specific turnover of €1 million and there's positive cash flow. And this lab, there's no reason to sell it. So it's not meant to be sold. There's no exit conversation to be had. So this is an example. What's worth mentioning here is that, we're putting it together in one way. And it's actually more of a toolbox. I like to describe it as a box of Legos, where on the front of the box you have a picture of a house that you can build with the Lego pieces, and that's what we're doing with the first RCO. But you can pull it apart and put it together in a new way that's contextually more relevant for whatever context an organization happens to be in. So InnerWorks exists, it's been up and running for a couple of months. And what we're exploring now, if we go to the next slide,
Before you say
is,
that, I just
yeah,
wanted to say something about when we reach that maturing, when we move into a maturing phase, what we're basically proposing is that instead of taking all of the resources to grow and stabilize the organism that we are currently building, we will start putting resources back into the ecosystem. So there's a way that we can resource the association to fund the community or research projects or events or public awareness efforts or whatever it may be relating to this question of how can we transform business to create the world we want our kids to live in, or we want for our kids. So there's that's what happens when we reach that. That's why we are putting up this. The 1 million euros is a relevant benchmark for it to do the work we need to do. That's sufficient for us in terms of financial capital, and then we'll start resourcing the ecosystem with excess capital after that. So to say, I just wanted to add that.
thank you for adding that, because it allows me to also add that since we then put energy back into the question, and the question is always what we look at and what's driving us. I think something that happens when you start working with questions rather than statements or solutions is that your mind tends to become a little bit more scientific and understand that there might be more answers to a question. And perhaps with each answer, we're just taking a deeper step into the question and we're never done, most likely. So what this allows us to do is to treat a company as a hypothesis rather than a solution. And if a hypothesis starts working financially, it makes sense for it to take some of that energy, some of that money, and feed it back into the question so we can test other hypotheses and keep experimenting and keep moving towards the question. It was a good bridge to the next slide. So we are exploring multiple hypotheses to the same overarching questions, but has slightly variations of the question. So where we're at now, to give you kind of an idea of where we're at, is that we're now rolling out a second company connected to the same RCO. The purpose, this is called Coherent. It's an AI company. It's a companion for next level teamwork. And the hypothesis is basically, well, what if teamwork and human relationships in a work context can bring us closer to this overarching question? And the sub question for Coherent is, how can we improve self-awareness and relationships in teams? We're using the same nonprofit association, but a different limited company. This company has a different life cycle design. So there's a turnover and a positive cash flow signal, but this is also a company that can and perhaps needs some kind of investors. So with the investments, we can also look at what is the value growth or the value increase that we foresee, could act as a signal for when we're mature enough to start sending some of the energy once again back into the center, back into the question. So I think we might have a picture of the idea of adding more companies to the same question exactly. So what this actually allows us to do is run multiple hypotheses, create multiple companies, startups, all working towards the same question, but they're completely different companies, different solutions, different business cases, different founder teams, different investors, whatever you like, but they're all connected to the same question through the same RCO structure and the same nonprofit association. And they can come and go and they can die and wither away. And it becomes, in theory and in our minds and hearts, it becomes more of an ecosystem where there's connection, as if we're all plants in a meadow as companies rather than just separated, isolated things working on solutions. I'm going to stop there. Amit, anything to add?
No, I think just open up for questions for a few minutes and then maybe hand the space back if there are any. I haven't been following
Let's look in the
the
chat.
chat.
There was a link on the last slide because there's tons of technical details for anyone interested. We're not going to cover that here, but it's on the website and you can talk to us as well.
Yeah, that's a good That's a really good question, Xavier, in terms of whether the OpenAI's sort of failure to do the non-profit thing has an influence. We've been thinking a lot about that. Um, I think someone said today in a conversation that the system's culture, the culture is the system. And I think there's a way that we're not going to be able to transcend our culture unless we actually work actively with our culture. And so we're running some experiments in terms of like seeding the culture that we want to see and really taking care and nurturing the culture in the Awareness Association. That's an ongoing activity that we have. And hopefully we won't there might be a hopefully a space of an island of insanity, I like to say, something that's different from the mainstream culture within the Awareness Association that would allow us to actually do governance in a different way. um, but yeah, that is it's going to be very hard. I mean, what we're doing here, that there is a similar pattern in that's quite well used, which is a foundation at the top, and then you have different limited companies doing business. And the reason why we are stepping away from that is because of the fact that we want to put humans back in control. We don't want to outsource the final control or the final plan to a legal structure, to a technical structure. And that might be naive, but I think it is right. And so there's something of an ideological statement here, and looking at the examples and looking at how these ambitions play out in different places where OpenAI was, a board did what they were supposed to do, but then the current culture values the hero higher than the board or than the purpose. So that's where we are. It's just information, I think, to be aware of.
I can speak to Carol's question that came in before. Amit mentioned that the limited company kind of hires the nonprofit. How do we make sure the nonprofit don't compromise on the purpose when its livelihood is dependent on the company? It's not fully dependent on the company. So the nonprofit needs to be its own functioning entity. People step into it and most likely pay a membership fee of sorts because they care and they believe in the question, and perhaps they also want to have a look inside the companies and have a say in what the company is up to in one way or another. It's also non-profit association. So at least in the legal jurisdiction we're active at the moment, that means no individual member can have financial benefit by just being a member. So no of the individuals, except if you're on the board or you get paid somehow, has that kind of connection. But mostly it's the payment is through preferred shares ownership. So there's no payment going to the limited company to oversee it beyond the ownership. But then as a company, or sorry, to the nonprofit association, as any company grows to the maturing phase and starts sending energy in the form of resources back to the center, um, those resources are obviously meant to be used in whatever way makes the most sense for the nonprofit association. But there are legal structures there where we suggest you actually put it in an investment company rather than into the association itself. We're just going to skip that for now, but maybe do you want to add something to that, Amit?
No, just to double click on what you said, the nonprofit has to be self-sustaining financially to the extent that, again, what's sufficient, and the same thing for the company, I think. And yeah, I just wanted to, as we leave the space back, keeping the punctuality, sort of. I'm putting a question in the chat, maybe to give like a 30 seconds of silence, to just reflect on, or an invitation to reflect on, if you would express what your work is about as a question. What would that question be? If you would express what your work is about as a question, what would that question be?
And if you want, you can post it. You can just keep it to yourself. Do whatever you want.
with that, Amanda, I'm also handing it back to you.
Thank you. Wow. I really like your tone of voice, how you can speak very calmly of such complex things. It makes it seem more, it makes it seem softer, and the colors that you choose also, it gives me a sense of softness. So thank you. Yeah. So we're gonna have a 5-minute break and come back to hear from Valerie.